Welcome to this book fest session, which is called What It's Like Inside a Shallow Grave with Doug Kari. And I'm obviously here with Doug Kari. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, KJ.
I'm so excited to be able to speak with you. I was looking into your background and I realized we have two things in common. We're both journalists and we both have an interest in true crime stories. So I love that we can start right off the bat with those two things in common.
Absolutely.
Right. So before we get into it, just tell everybody kind of your background in a nutshell. I know you were a journalist and you've moved into being an author now. We're going to get to your new book, but tell everybody a little bit about your background initially.
Well, I'd like to step back in time to my grandmother. Imagine you're a woman in your mid 50s, your
Mhm.
husband passes away. Now you're a widow, you have a pension. So, what do you do with the rest of your life? My grandmother chose to move into the middle of the desert into a cabin where there was no electricity, only kerosene lamps. She bought a four-wheel drive truck and strapped a gun to her hip and started exploring the desert and gathering artifacts and telling stories. And this captured my imagination. So that's what drew me into writing. And as far as my background, the legal overlay, don't hold it against me, but I'm a lawyer, have been for many years, and that
Wow.
makes me interested in law as well. And so the writing, the law come together in true crime.
Wow. So many journalists take so many different avenues. I took the avenue of moving from hard news into entertainment. You've obviously moved into more of the authentic stories or some certain crime stories. What made you interested in this type of storytelling?
So again, let me just take you on a little journey. Imagine that we get in a car and
Mhm.
we drive out into the desert to a little house that a woman lives in, and she's waiting. When you get there, she opens the door and she has pictures and documents laid out on a table, and she starts telling you the story of her husband who vanished without a trace 2 years ago. This is not an invented drama. This is real life, real characters, real people who find themselves in unimaginable situations. And that's very interesting to me. It's compelling. And I think a lot of people feel the same way. And I always want to understand in these situations what happened, what exactly happened, and why it happened. A lot of true crime people, they're big on the what happened, especially the kind of sensational details. But I think it's just as important to get into the, if you can, try to plumb the depths of why it happened and try to get to the bottom of it. That's what I think a lot of people appreciate about true crime, and that's what I try to bring to the table.
Well, journalists, I think in general, a lot of them always like to know the why behind it, which is why I think that journalists are very great storytellers when it comes to stories like true crime and things like that. Just because they always want to know the who, what, why, when, and where. Why did they do it? When did they do it? Where did they do it? How did they do it? Those are always the things that they want to get into. And segueing into that, I want to talk about the Berman Murders, which is your new book. If you can tell me a little bit about that.
So, KJ, what happened there is that two people vanished in the desert. They were a couple on a romantic trip. They'd had a tough year. They called it a makeup trip. And they they headed out into a desert wilderness, a sublime and beautiful place called Saline Valley. It's difficult to get there. And where they landed was a spot that, for lack of a better term, you might call hippie hot springs or a counterculture oasis. It was a place where people freely shed their clothes, soaked together in tubs. There was alcohol and weed, but it wasn't a hedonistic kind of a place. It was more a back to nature, get real, and be in this beautiful desert wilderness sort of place.
Yeah.
They get up in the morning and they go on a hike and they never come back.
Yeah.
3 years later, their bodies turned up in a shallow grave.
Mhm.
That's what drew me to the story was how could something like this happen in a place so remote and so beautiful to two people who were loving, peaceful. They didn't even eat meat because they thought that slaying of animals would bring bad karma. And that's what the Berman Murders is about. Again, I wanted to understand what happened and why it happened.
Yeah. With the true crime genre now, there's so many podcasts, there's so many documentaries, docu-series, but they're not all the same. Some of them are very exploitative, unfortunately, but some of them really have compassion and really take you through the viewpoint of the victim's family or the people that are most affected by that. And I think journalists have a good grasp on that. And I'm wondering, in telling this story, was that something that you grapple with in making sure that it's not coming across as exploitative, especially during this time when there seems to be a high interest in true crime stories in general?
That was very important to me, KJ, because the friends and family who opened themselves to me, who shared with me, were very thoughtful, sensitive people, and they dearly loved these folks who were lost. And they didn't want to see their story exploited for clicks or for simply sensational details. Look, some of the details of true crime, they're sensational enough. You don't have to turn up the volume on that. And what I wanted to do was understand the entire context of who the folks were, what
Mhm.
happened to them, and how their lives led to the point that it did, and maybe find some meaning in it. And same thing with the person that is the prime suspect. In the Berman murders, no one's ever been arrested, no one's ever been prosecuted, no one's ever gone to jail. But I made it a point of wanting to understand who the suspect was, why he possibly did this, and what the evidence was, and then present the case and let the readers decide. And again, I didn't want to make it a black and white presentation. His family members cooperated with me, I think, in part because I truly wanted to understand who is this man? And is it possible that he did this? And if so, why?
Wow. That's a lot. So many, I think, TV producers, TV writers, authors like yourself, are such great storytellers that they make it look easy when it's really not. It's very hard to tell a story that resonates with a lot of people when people can keep up with it, especially if it's a complex story that has a lot of different angles and a lot of twists and turns. It's very hard to make it look like it's easy. And so I'm wondering, how do you tell a compelling story? What kind of advice would you give to people out there who'd love to craft a story like the one you're talking about, and do it in a meaningful way that's not exploitative, but that's well told?
Well, I hope that I accomplished that in the Berman murders, KJ, but I'll tell you, if I did, it did not come easily. I started working on the book nearly 10 years ago. And as I got into the project, I started publishing articles. So, in effect, I was telling short stories, and that was helpful for developing it. But as for developing it into a book and enriching it with all of the elements that I wanted to bring to the table and I thought were important to tell a complete and authoritative story, it was incredibly difficult. And I had an initial draft, and I actually hired an editor, a
Oh, wow.
well recommended person to look at it. And you know what, KJ, the outcome of that effort, when I read what he told me,
Uh,
essentially what I read was this doesn't work. This scrap
really?
it. Yeah, scrap it. That's what I read between the lines. Scrap it and start over. But
Oh,
what I realized was that I needed more work. And so I started working on other cases, publishing more articles, getting published in a wider range of newspapers and publications, and honing my craft at the same time I was developing the story. But it takes a lot of work. And I think most importantly, KJ, it's that, well, I would say two things. One is to just stick with it until you get to a point where you truly believe you've done your best. And
mhm.
the other is to not take it personally.
Yeah.
to, yeah, to understand that you may be missing the mark. And if somebody you respect tells you that, it's best to listen rather than let your ego get in the way. And that's hard. That's
Mhm.
really hard.
Yeah, it's just as a journalist myself, it's so hard because it's your baby. You know what I mean? You put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into your project, whether you're producing something or you're writing something for television or just being an author for a book. You spend a lot of time in it, normally doing a lot of research and writing and rewriting. And so when you put your baby out there to somebody, you want them to kind of cuddle it, so to speak, and be very careful with it. So it is hard to take criticism, I would say. I'm wondering, since you are in this genre, are there any authors or people that you look up to that you think are doing it right, or anything on television that you've seen lately with regard to true crime or podcasts that you look at and you say they're doing it right, or I admire that author and their true crime?
I don't spend a lot of time with the podcasts and the social media, except in the context of projects that I'm working on, because the social media itself often
Mhm.
becomes one of the forces in the story. I'm working on a case like that now where it was a girl who was abducted and ultimately found murdered in a
Mm,
pre-dug grave in a
okay.
small town in Nevada. And as the story developed, this huge social media wave came crashing over the case. And that in of itself became a force, a dynamic that needed to be dealt with. But since you asked, I will mention one. People Magazine Investigates ran a segment on the Carly Gousset case, which is a case where I've published several articles and I've followed for years.
Yeah,
And
very
I'm
well done. I watch their series and I also read it, and it's not exploitative at all. Very informative and very well researched. As a journalist, I do really love the way their stories are researched.
I felt exactly the same way, KJ. I thought they did it right. And I was really impressed. Perhaps because the name People magazine was attached, I might have lowered my expectations. And I have pretty high expectations when it comes to research and being thoughtful, being balanced. And I was pleasantly surprised when I saw how they dealt with the subject matter. Like you mentioned, well researched, very
Mhm.
thoughtful. And what got me too was that the way they balance different elements of the story, there is controversy in that story. There are people who think perhaps the parents were involved. Other people think law enforcement fell down. There's all these theories, and they were very balanced in how they and even-handed in how they dealt with all that. So I would give them high marks. In terms of influences on me, I mean, the classic one, of course, is Truman Capote in Cold
Oh
Blood. That's
yes.
for
Oh yes.
anybody in true
That's the
crime.
standard.
That's the standard. Yeah, that becomes the benchmark. I love John Krakauer, all of his writing, and he had a book that in essence is a true crime book, Under the Banner of Heaven, that influenced me a lot. And but in terms of, I would say, what I would strive for, Case Closed by Gerald Posner, where he
Mm,
dissected the Kennedy assassination, for me remains the gold standard. And anybody who's fascinated by the JFK case and what
mhm.
happened, was there a single gunman or were there multiple gunmen? What really happened? Gerald Posner, to me, that's the authoritative book on the subject. And the name Case Closed is perfectly apt for what he did in that project.
Great. I could go on and on talking to you. You're just so interesting. And I'm so happy that you're coming out with this book. I can't wait to really dive into it. But we're running out of time. And I just want to thank you so much, Doug Kari, for speaking with me today and remind everybody where they can find you and where they can buy your upcoming book.
So I'm Doug Kari Author on Facebook and at Doug Kari Author on Instagram. I will be having a Doug Kari Author webpage. We're working on that. So that's where you can find me on social media. And it's a pleasure to engage with readers. And KJ, it was a pleasure to talk with you about this. It's a fascinating subject, and I appreciate your interest in it.
Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Kari. And thank you, everybody, for attending the Book Fest. And thank you for attending our session.